What if I told you that the love and approval you've been chasing from others could actually be the very thing keeping you from true freedom, and that the key to breaking free has been within you all along? Emotional dependency often hides in the subtle spaces between affection and attachment, making it difficult to recognize at first. It begins quietly, disguised as deep care, loyalty, or connection. A person may believe they are simply being loving, supportive, or committed, when in reality they are beginning to lose the boundaries that define their own sense of self. The danger lies in the slow erosion of individuality, which happens not through dramatic events, but through small, almost invisible compromises. Each time one silences their own needs to preserve harmony, ignores personal boundaries to keep another happy, or measures their worth by the moods and reactions of someone else, a part of the self slips into the shadows. What once felt like healthy closeness begins to take on the weight of dependence, and the difference between love and emotional captivity becomes increasingly blurred. This process is so subtle because it often aligns with cultural or personal ideals of devotion. Many are taught that true love means selflessness, sacrifice, and putting others first. While these qualities can be beautiful in balanced relationships, when taken to an extreme, they become the very tools that dismantle one's identity. Over time, the person who is emotionally dependent finds themselves living almost entirely through the experiences, opinions, and validation of another. Their happiness becomes tethered to external conditions rather than arising from within. They may feel empty when apart from the person they depend on, or anxious about the possibility of losing them. In such moments, love is no longer a choice but a necessity, and connection becomes less about joy and more about survival. What makes emotional dependency so insidious is its ability to masquerade as something noble. Friends and family may even praise the dependent person for their devotion, without realizing that beneath this apparent dedication lies a quiet erosion of personal freedom. The dependent individual often fails to see it too, because the initial feelings are pleasant: warmth, closeness, belonging. These emotions act like a soft veil that hides the underlying imbalance. Only later, when the demands of maintaining this closeness grow heavier, does the cost become clear. The dependent person may start to feel drained, resentful, or confused about who they truly are without the other person's presence shaping their identity. Another reason it is hard to detect is that emotional dependency can feel intoxicating. The highs of being validated, loved, and needed can be so powerful that they overshadow the warning signs. The attention and affirmation feed a deep longing, but this nourishment is temporary, requiring constant replenishment. This cycle creates a fragile foundation for relationships, where stability is dependent on factors outside one's control. The illusion of safety it provides can be addictive, even as it erodes the ability to stand independently. In this way, emotional dependency quietly transforms what should be a space of mutual growth and freedom into a form of captivity. It is a gentle but persistent drift away from the center of one's own being, until the self becomes a faint reflection shaped entirely by another's light. At the heart of emotional dependency lies a deep, often unexamined longing that shapes how a person relates to themselves and to others. This longing is not inherently harmful. In fact, it is part of what makes human beings social and connected creatures. Every individual carries a natural desire for safety, love, and validation, rooted in early experiences of care and belonging. As children, survival depends on the acceptance and protection of caregivers, and those early bonds teach the nervous system that connection is essential for emotional and physical well-being. When those bonds are secure, a sense of inner stability forms, making it possible to love freely while maintaining autonomy. However, when there are gaps, inconsistencies, or emotional wounds in those formative relationships, the longing for love and reassurance can grow into a persistent ache, one that seeks fulfillment in external sources long after childhood has ended. This ache becomes the seed of dependency when self-worth is tied to another person's approval or attention. Instead of being grounded in an internal sense of value, the self becomes fragile, easily swayed by how others perceive and treat it. A kind word can create a surge of confidence, while a moment of disapproval can bring everything crashing down. In such a dynamic, relationships begin to feel less like choices and more like lifelines. The individual clings to others not simply for companionship, but for a sense of existence and identity. This is not love in its fullest sense, but a pursuit of emotional oxygen without which one feels they cannot breathe. Over time, the dependency can shape a person's behavior in subtle but powerful ways. They may avoid expressing disagreement for fear of losing approval, or they may take on roles and responsibilities that are draining simply to be needed. Even moments of silence or absence from the person they depend on can trigger anxiety, leading to overthinking, constant checking, or seeking reassurance. The focus of life shifts from living authentically to managing and preserving the bond at all costs, often at the expense of personal growth. The roots of this dynamic often stretch far into the past, entwined with unresolved emotional experiences. A child who learned that love had to be earned through obedience, performance, or pleasing behavior may carry that same strategy into adulthood, believing they must continually prove their worth to be loved. A child who felt unseen or dismissed may grow into an adult who becomes hyper, attuned to others' moods, striving to meet needs before they are even voiced, hoping to secure affection in return. These patterns can persist even when the current relationship is with someone caring and supportive, because the longing being addressed is not just about the present. It is about filling a gap that began long ago. The challenge is that while this longing is genuine and deeply human, it cannot be fully satisfied by another person. External validation may soothe the ache temporarily, but without an inner foundation of self-acceptance and self-worth, the hunger always returns, creating an endless cycle of seeking and dependence. At the core of emotional dependency is a profound longing, a deep inner hunger for safety, love, and validation that shapes how a person experiences relationships. This longing is not a flaw, it is part of the human condition rooted in the earliest stages of life. From the moment of birth, survival depends on connection. An infant learns through touch, tone, and presence that they are safe and valued, and these early bonds lay the groundwork for how the self develops. When those bonds are consistent, nurturing, and secure, a child learns that love is a natural state, not something that must be earned. But when care is inconsistent, conditional, or absent, the developing mind begins to associate love with uncertainty, and the heart grows restless, always searching for signs of acceptance. This early emotional imprint becomes the seed from which dependency can grow. The longing becomes problematic when one's sense of worth becomes tethered to the approval or attention of others. Instead of feeling grounded in an inner sense of self, the individual's identity wavers with external cues. A compliment or moment of affection may create an intense rush of reassurance, while disapproval or emotional distance can trigger deep insecurity and fear. This constant fluctuation leaves a person feeling unstable, as if they have no anchor except in the reactions of others. Over time, the relationship is no longer simply about companionship or shared experience, but about survival of the self-image. Without the other person's affirmation, the dependent individual may feel invisible or incomplete. This dynamic often shapes behavior in subtle but powerful ways. The person may begin to suppress their own needs, preferences, or opinions to maintain harmony. They might become hyper, attuned to the moods of the other, adjusting themselves constantly in the hope of securing continued approval. In some cases, they avoid setting boundaries out of fear that doing so will create distance or rejection. Even small signs of disconnection, such as a delayed message or a change in tone, can trigger overthinking, self-doubt, and a desperate urge to re-establish closeness. The longing for validation becomes like a compass, but one that points away from the self and toward the unpredictable terrain of someone else's emotions. The roots of this longing often stretch back into childhood experiences that left emotional needs unmet. A child who learned that love came only when they performed well, obeyed without question, or met the needs of others before their own may grow into an adult who repeats the same pattern. A child who was dismissed, criticized, or emotionally neglected may carry into adulthood a deep need to prove their worth to others. These early lessons become unconscious scripts that shape adult relationships, even when the current partner or friend is caring and supportive. The emotional dependency is not solely about the present relationship, it is about trying to soothe an old wound, one that has never been fully acknowledged or healed. This longing, though genuine and human, cannot be satisfied entirely through another person. External approval may offer temporary comfort, but without building an inner foundation of self-worth, the hunger inevitably returns, pulling the person deeper into the cycle of dependence. Losing touch with one's inner voice is one of the most profound consequences of emotional dependency, and it often happens so gradually that it goes unnoticed until the sense of self feels faint and unfamiliar. The inner voice, that quiet but steady presence within, is the source of personal truth, guiding choices, expressing authentic desires, and offering a sense of stability even in uncertain circumstances. When this voice is strong, it allows a person to act in alignment with their values rather than in reaction to external demands. But in the landscape of dependency, this inner compass becomes overshadowed by the constant need to monitor, adapt to, and please others. Decisions that once might have been based on personal conviction become filtered through the question, what will they think? Or, will this make them happy? As a result, actions begin to serve the maintenance of the relationship rather than the flourishing of the self. The silencing of the inner voice can start with small compromises. Perhaps someone avoids expressing a personal opinion to prevent conflict or hides an aspect of themselves out of fear it will not be accepted. These acts may seem harmless at first, but repeated over time, they train the mind to look outward for guidance instead of inward. In doing so, the person's own needs and preferences fade into the background, replaced by an over-reliance on others for direction. The individual becomes reactive rather than self-directed, waiting to see what others want before deciding how to act. This loss of inner authority creates a deep sense of instability. Without a clear connection to one's own truth, even minor disagreements or changes in someone else's mood can feel like a threat. The dependent person may begin to doubt themselves constantly, questioning whether their feelings are valid or if they are overreacting. Over time, this erodes confidence, leaving them unsure of who they truly are when they are not in relation to another person's needs or opinions. The world becomes a place where safety is found not within, but only in the shifting approval of others, making it impossible to feel fully secure. The danger of losing this inner voice is that it not only diminishes authenticity, but it also limits growth. When a person continually shapes themselves to fit the expectations of others, they miss the opportunity to explore new paths, take risks, or discover strengths that emerge only when one acts independently. They may stay in situations or relationships that are unfulfilling simply because they fear the uncertainty that comes with making choices from their own center. The result is a life lived in adaptation rather than creation, one that reflects the desires of others more than the dreams of the self. Reconnecting with the inner voice requires first noticing how often it has been silenced. It involves paying attention to moments of hesitation, discomfort, or resentment, as these often signal that personal truth is being ignored. Over time, rebuilding trust in that voice allows it to grow louder, guiding the individual back to a life shaped by authenticity rather than dependency. Recognizing the patterns of emotional dependency is an essential step toward reclaiming personal freedom. Yet it is often more challenging than it sounds because these patterns can be deeply ingrained and disguised as care, loyalty, or love. They tend to emerge in repeated situations and behaviors that at first feel normal or even admirable, but over time reveal themselves as signs of imbalance. One of the most common patterns is the tendency to say, yes when the genuine answer is no. This often comes from a fear of displeasing others or creating conflict, leading to a habit of suppressing personal boundaries in order to maintain harmony. While the momentary peace this brings can feel comforting, it gradually teaches the mind and body that the needs of others are always more important than one's own, reinforcing the cycle of dependency. Another clear sign is an inability to feel comfortable when alone. Solitude for an emotionally dependent person can feel unsettling or even frightening because their sense of self is so intertwined with another person's presence. Instead of being a space for reflection and self-connection, time alone becomes a void that must be filled with contact, reassurance, or activity that maintains a link to the person they depend on. This avoidance of solitude prevents the development of inner resilience and keeps the individual in a state of constant outward focus. A related pattern is the anxiety that surfaces when external affirmation is missing. Small gaps in communication, such as a delayed reply or a lack of verbal reassurance, can trigger intense worry, self-doubt, or overthinking. The dependent person may begin to question the stability of the relationship or even their own worth in its absence. This anxiety often leads to behaviors aimed at restoring closeness, such as over-communicating, seeking reassurance, or preemptively accommodating the other person's needs, even at personal cost. Over time, this creates a feedback loop in which the person's emotional state becomes directly linked to another's responsiveness or mood. These patterns are not random. They are often rooted in earlier experiences where love, attention, or approval was conditional. By observing them closely, it becomes possible to trace them back to moments in the past when one first learned that securing connection required self-sacrifice or constant vigilance. Recognizing this connection to the past is crucial because it shifts the understanding of dependency from a current flaw to an old survival strategy that once served a purpose but now limits growth. Awareness of these patterns allows for the possibility of change. The more a person notices their automatic reactions, the quick agreement to avoid conflict, the discomfort in solitude, the heightened sensitivity to signs of disconnection, the more they can pause and question whether these responses align with their authentic needs and values. This act of mindful observation is the first opening through which self-awareness enters, creating the space for new, healthier ways of relating to both others and oneself. Tracing emotional dependency back to its origins is a powerful step in understanding why it holds such a strong grip, because these patterns rarely begin in adulthood. They are often rooted in early experiences that shaped a person's understanding of love, safety, and self-worth. In childhood, relationships with caregivers form the blueprint for how an individual learns to connect with others. When love is unconditional, consistent, and nurturing, it teaches a child that they are valued simply for being themselves. But when love feels conditional, inconsistent, or absent, the developing mind begins to adapt in order to preserve connection, even at the cost of personal authenticity. For some, this adaptation might have meant staying quiet to avoid criticism, becoming overly helpful to earn affection, or suppressing certain feelings to prevent rejection. These strategies may have been necessary in the context of childhood, where dependence on caregivers was absolute, but they leave a lasting imprint on the psyche. Without realizing it, the adult continues to use the same strategies, now directed toward friends, partners, or colleagues. What once served as a survival mechanism becomes a limiting pattern that shapes every significant relationship. The moment one begins to trace these patterns back, memories and emotions often surface that shed light on their persistence. It may become clear that the anxiety felt when someone pulls away in the present mirrors the fear once felt when a caregiver was emotionally unavailable. Similarly, the urge to over-accommodate in adult relationships can reflect the unspoken rule learned in childhood, that love must be earned through self-sacrifice. These early lessons often go unchallenged for years because they are so deeply woven into the unconscious mind that they feel like truths rather than learned behaviors. Looking back with awareness does not mean dwelling in the past or assigning blame. It means recognizing that the origins of dependency were formed in a time when choices were limited and the priority was survival, not self-expression. This perspective helps to dissolve the shame that often accompanies dependency, replacing it with compassion for the younger self who had to adapt in order to feel safe and loved. From this place of understanding, it becomes possible to question whether these old strategies still serve a purpose in the present. Tracing the pattern to its source also creates the opportunity to rewrite the internal narrative. Instead of believing, "I must please others to be loved," or "I am only valuable when needed," a person can begin to explore new beliefs that honor their inherent worth. The past cannot be changed, but the meaning attached to it can. By identifying the point where emotional dependency first took root, the individual can consciously choose to respond differently in current relationships, creating new experiences that affirm both connection and autonomy. This process transforms dependency from an invisible force shaping life into a pattern that can be understood, managed, and ultimately healed. The inward journey of reclaiming oneself from emotional dependency begins with the willingness to turn away from the constant noise of external validation and enter the quieter, often uncomfortable space of solitude. For someone accustomed to defining themselves through the reflections they see in others, being alone can initially feel like standing in an empty room with no windows. The absence of another person's approval, attention, or guidance can bring a rush of restlessness, anxiety, or even fear. Yet it is precisely in this space that the first seeds of self-reconnection can be planted. By remaining in solitude long enough to hear the subtle rhythms of one's own thoughts and feelings, the individual begins to rediscover an inner landscape that has long been overshadowed. Listening to the self requires patience and gentleness. The inner voice that has been silenced or ignored for years will not necessarily speak loudly at first. It may appear only as a faint impulse, a small preference, a quiet resistance, a subtle curiosity. These whispers are easily dismissed, especially when they conflict with the habits of compliance or people-pleasing that dependency has built. However, honoring even the smallest of these inner signals sends a message to the self: you are heard, you matter. Over time, this consistent act of listening begins to rebuild trust in one's own perception and judgment. Acting on these inner truths does not have to involve dramatic change. Small steps are enough to begin strengthening the connection with the self. This could mean voicing an honest opinion in a conversation, choosing an activity purely because it feels nourishing, or setting a gentle boundary where none existed before. These acts may feel unfamiliar or even risky at first, especially for someone who has long equated self-assertion with the loss of love or acceptance. Yet each step reinforces the truth that it is possible to honor oneself without severing meaningful bonds. As the inward journey continues, moments of resistance will arise, both internally and from others. Internally, the mind may revert to old fears, questioning whether this self-focus is selfish or whether it will lead to abandonment. Externally, people who are accustomed to the dependent dynamic may feel unsettled by the shift and attempt to restore the old balance. Navigating these challenges requires courage and persistence, as well as the understanding that independence does not mean disconnection. It means engaging with others from a place of choice rather than need, where the relationship is enriched by authenticity rather than sustained by sacrifice. The deeper one travels inward, the clearer it becomes that emotional dependencies was never truly about another person's presence, but about the absence of one's own. Rebuilding that presence through solitude, self-listening, and small acts of self-alignment creates a foundation strong enough to support both individuality and connection. The inward journey is less about finding something new than about uncovering what has always been there, waiting patiently beneath the layers of adaptation and longing. When a person begins to reclaim their independence from emotional dependency, it is not uncommon for others in their life to react with discomfort or even resistance. This is especially true when the relationship has long been shaped by the dependent dynamic, where one person's needs, moods, and preferences have consistently taken precedence. Independence disrupts that balance, challenging unspoken agreements and exposing patterns that may have gone unnoticed. For someone who has benefited, consciously or unconsciously, from the other's dependency, the shift can feel like a loss of control or importance. They may interpret the newfound autonomy as distance, disinterest, or rejection, even if the intention is simply to restore balance. This resistance can take many forms, some subtle and others more direct. It might appear as guilt, tripping, where the independent person is made to feel selfish or ungrateful for focusing on themselves. It can emerge as criticism disguised as concern, questioning whether they have changed for the worse. In some cases, the other person might increase their demands for attention, time, or reassurance in an effort to pull things back to the way they were. These reactions are not always malicious. They are often rooted in the other person's own insecurities, fears of abandonment or dependence. Nevertheless, they can make the journey toward independence more challenging, especially if the individual reclaiming themselves is still learning to trust their own needs and boundaries. In these moments, it is essential to remember that independence in a relationship is not an act of rejection. It is a restructuring that allows for a healthier, more sustainable connection. True closeness cannot thrive when it is built on fear, obligation, or one-sided effort. It flourishes when both people feel free to be fully themselves while choosing to stay connected. However, this truth may not be immediately understood or accepted by others, and patience is required on both sides. For the person seeking independence, standing firm in new boundaries while remaining compassionate can help maintain relationships through this transition. This means continuing to communicate openly about intentions, expressing that autonomy is not a withdrawal of love, but an affirmation of selfhood. It also means resisting the urge to over-explain or over-justify every choice, as doing so can pull the person back into patterns of seeking approval. Instead, clarity and consistency in actions will gradually reinforce the new dynamic. This phase of the journey is also a test of resilience. The discomfort from others may trigger old habits of compliance or self-sacrifice, tempting the person to return to familiar but limiting roles. Recognizing these moments as part of the growth process allows them to become opportunities for practicing the very independence being cultivated. Over time, those who genuinely value and respect the individual will adjust, finding new ways to relate that honor mutual autonomy. Those who cannot may drift away, creating space for healthier connections to emerge. In either case, staying committed to the truth of one's own worth ensures that the independence gained is not temporary, but becomes a lasting foundation for future relationships. Wholeness is the state of recognizing and embodying the truth that you are complete in yourself, not merely a fragment waiting for someone else to fill the missing spaces. In the context of emotional dependency, this realization can be revolutionary because dependency often convinces a person that they are only valuable when connected to or approved by another. Wholeness shifts that perspective entirely, revealing that the essence of your being exists independently of external validation. This understanding does not diminish the beauty of connection. Rather, it allows relationships to be entered into from a place of fullness rather than need. When you know you are whole, love becomes a choice instead of a survival mechanism. The path to this awareness begins with disentangling identity from relationships. Independency, self-worth often feels like it is borrowed from someone else's perception. If they are pleased, you feel worthy. If they are displeased, you feel diminished. Wholeness demands that this borrowed sense of self be returned, and that you reclaim the right to define who you are without leaning on the constantly shifting opinions of others. This does not mean isolating yourself or rejecting intimacy, but it does mean anchoring your sense of value in something internal, stable, and authentic. Living from a place of wholeness changes the nature of emotional exchange. When you no longer seek a partner, friend, or family member to complete you, the dynamics shift toward mutual respect and shared growth. You can give freely without the hidden expectation that the other person must constantly reassure you or protect you from feelings of emptiness. You can receive love without fear that it will disappear if you express disagreement, set boundaries, or show your full, unfiltered self. In this way, wholeness strengthens connection because it removes the tension of hidden dependency. Cultivating this sense of completeness requires ongoing self-reflection and a willingness to meet your own needs rather than outsourcing them entirely to others. It might involve exploring personal interests without waiting for someone else to join, developing skills that reinforce confidence, or nurturing inner resources like resilience and self-compassion. Each time you act in a way that affirms your independence, you strengthen the foundation on which wholeness rests. It is important to understand that wholeness is not about perfection or an absence of vulnerability. Being whole does not mean you will never feel lonely, uncertain, or in need of support. Rather, it means you can acknowledge those feelings without believing they define your worth. You can seek comfort without losing yourself in the process, and you can love deeply without fearing that your identity will dissolve into the other person. Wholeness is the recognition that you are already enough, exactly as you are, and that relationships are an enhancement to life, not the source of your existence. This understanding transforms dependency into a healthy interdependence, where two complete individuals choose to walk together, not because they must, but because they genuinely want to share the path freedom in self. Reconnection emerges when the grip of emotional dependency loosens and the individual begins to live from their own center, rather than constantly orienting themselves around others. It is the moment when the constant scanning for approval fades, when decisions are guided by inner truth rather than fear of disapproval, and when solitude becomes a source of nourishment instead of discomfort. This freedom is not about cutting ties or rejecting relationships, but about reclaiming the ability to stand in one's own space without losing balance. It allows connection to become an act of choice rather than necessity, grounded in authenticity rather than need. Reconnecting with the self brings a deep sense of stability that is not easily shaken by the shifting moods or opinions of others. Where dependency once caused emotional highs and lows based on external reactions, self-reconnection creates an inner steadiness. Compliments and affirmations can still be appreciated, but they no longer define worth, as criticism can still be considered, but it no longer destroys confidence. This stability allows for more honest and open relationships because communication is no longer driven by the fear of losing approval. Instead, there is room for disagreement, individuality, and personal boundaries, all of which strengthen connection rather than weaken it. With this freedom comes the ability to pursue personal growth without constant concern about how it will be received by others. Dreams, goals, and interests that may have been set aside to maintain harmony in relationships can now be explored without guilt. The individual becomes more willing to take risks, try new experiences, and follow paths that feel aligned with their deeper values. This sense of exploration is a natural extension of self-reconnection, as the energy once spent on managing dependency is now available for creativity, learning, and meaningful action. Another transformation that occurs in this state is the shift in how love is given and received. Without dependency, love becomes less about filling an emptiness and more about sharing abundance. The desire to connect comes from a place of wholeness, which means the relationship is not weighed down by unspoken demands for constant reassurance. The other person is free to be themselves without the burden of being the sole provider of emotional stability, and the bond can grow from a space of mutual respect and choice. Self-reconnection also deepens the relationship with life itself. The individual becomes more attuned to their own rhythms, more aware of what brings genuine fulfillment, and more capable of setting boundaries that protect their well-being. There is a greater sense of freedom in saying yes to what feels right and no to what does not, without the cloud of guilt or fear that once accompanied such decisions. In this way, the freedom gained through self-reconnection is not only a personal victory, but also a gift to every relationship, because it allows connection to be based on truth, presence, and the joy of walking alongside another as a whole and independent being. True freedom begins when you no longer need others to define your worth. By breaking the cycle of emotional dependency and reconnecting with yourself, you create relationships rooted in choice, not need, allowing you to live from a place of wholeness, authenticity, and inner peace.